Alrighty, y'all. Today I want to ask the question, what is the purpose of suffering? Now, this is one that is probably one of the more common questions that people will ask themselves at some point in their life. What is the purpose of suffering? And the reason people ask that is because suffering is inevitable. Either, both to human beings, to animals, to, all of creation in some sense. Suffering is inevitable. So I want to frame this giving sort of the boundary markers for this question, and then maybe discussing some in between those boundary markers and how we can evaluate this question in a meaningful sort of a way. At the end, I'll kind of give you my current thoughts on this question. All right, so with the question of the purpose of suffering, there are quite obviously two different answers that could be given. The first would be that suffering is meaningless. It has no meaning whatsoever. And then the second would be that suffering is completely meaningful. It's 100% meaningful in every sort of a way. And then there's obviously a gradient between those two sort of views. And I would say on most questions, I think I take a view somewhere in the middle of the extremes. But on this one, I think I'm on the extreme over here, that suffering is completely meaningful in every possible way. And I think that can be demonstrated from just philosophy on certain points. It can be demonstrated just from philosophy in the natural world and our natural experience. And then on other ways, it does come down from revelation and theology. Okay, so I guess we should first look at the opposite extreme. What if suffering has no meaning whatsoever? And it's just completely arbitrary. There's no point in even really asking this question other than to come to the answer that suffering has no meaning, has no purpose, right? I think that's a completely laudable type of a view if you're looking at it from a detached perspective. If you're currently not going through a whole bunch of suffering, I think it's a lot easier to make that sort of a claim. Whereas when one is going through suffering, now whether this is a sociological or a psychological issue, or maybe it is something sociological, human beings generally try to find a meaning for their suffering. And this is because we try to find meaning in everything. Whether you think that's just because of how we've evolved as a species to try to find, the deeper questions of things to keep ourselves safe, to keep our, whatever one might say, or if you believe that there's something real to human nature that somehow causes this sort of longing for meaning. And whatever the answer to that might be, it's something that might transcend us in some way, whether that be God as classically defined, or some sort of pantheism, something like that. Those could be answers to this question. So, and this is just, it's such a deep question. It's really, I wasn't looking forward to doing this video. Because of how difficult this question is to evaluate. People often have very strong opinions on it because of their own life experiences, and it's a very, very interesting topic. So I guess maybe to get the ball rolling here, it might be helpful for me to divulge to you how I see the answer to this question. And it would be this, that suffering is utterly meaningful. It is completely meaningful in every possible sense. And here's some examples just from a natural point of view without getting into any sort of revelation or theology. First, you take just your physical body, your physical suffering. When you endure that suffering, it has the ability to make you greater. So think about an athlete. An athlete goes through the suffering of training, and it makes him stronger, makes him faster, makes whatever you want to say that. But even, let's say, the suffering of war, in everything there is a way for us to find a path through, to find the light at the end of the tunnel through every suffering. I really do believe that. I don't think that there's any sort of suffering that is just a dark abyss with no sort of good that could come out of it. And again, I think this is a tenable position from a completely natural perspective. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in any sort of religious practice or religion to take this sort of a claim that suffering is actually really meaningful. Now, a lot of people who aren't religious, don't take this claim, but I don't think that's because of their lack of religion or lack of belief in God. I think it's more so because oftentimes many of the premises that can come with a lack of belief in God will lend themselves to the person ending up thinking that suffering is meaningless. It's sort of nihilism. So, and I know a lot of people maybe don't take my view on this. Even a lot of religious people, a lot of Catholics, a lot of Christians don't take my view on this, that suffering is utterly meaningful, even from a natural perspective. I know a lot of Catholics would say, yes, suffering is utterly meaningful, but that's only because of Jesus Christ dying on the cross and us being able to offer our sufferings up with him, right, in union with him. But I would argue that every suffering we go through, whether physical or psychological, has the ability to move us further towards our end. Okay? And by towards our end, I mean the fulfillment of our human nature. Okay? The fulfillment of our human nature. Kind of what Aristotle talks about with his virtue ethics. That the sort of ultimately virtuous person has fulfilled his human nature, right? And I think that suffering is actually oftentimes the best way for us to cultivate virtue, just on a natural level. Those natural virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude, right? Just on a natural level, we can cultivate those virtues through suffering. And oftentimes suffering accelerates that process. It accelerates that process of making us more virtuous, just because of the state of what and who we are, right? We often, if we live very cushy lives without much suffering, we end up more often than not degrading ourselves in virtue rather than increasing ourselves in virtue. So that's just looking at it from a natural philosophical point of view. From a religious point of view, theological point of view, I would still say yes to this question, and I alluded to this earlier, because I believe that human beings can not only find a natural good out of their sufferings, but can even transcend that natural good, have there be a supernatural good that comes out of their sufferings because of the harmony of salvation history as it plays out in sacred scripture. Okay, so before the fall, Adam and Eve, human beings were meant to live on forever, meant to be quite, basically perfect. The fall happens, the original sin happens. That's no longer a reality. Our present reality is the reality. But Christ comes, redeems us, so that we can, again, get back to that preternatural, meaning like before the fall state, right? So that we can get back to that state that we were meant to have before the fall. And so that, after we die, the second coming of Christ, the bodily resurrection at the end of time, all those things might be resurrected with a new heaven and a new earth, and we'll be living basically in a new Eden once again, and everything will be how it should have been. So that's basically the really quick overview of the theodicy of Christianity and how it answers this question of suffering. Because through the cross of Christ, I have now able to see that even God took upon utter suffering and brought good out of it. And so I am able to unite myself by intention to offer my sufferings with him in union with God's own sufferings. God's sufferings in the sense that Jesus Christ has a divine nature and a human nature, and his human nature suffered, right? So, and in that way, my human nature can be conformed to his and transformed utterly. And this is where Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, Eastern or Oriental Orthodox theology oftentimes, not in all cases, but oftentimes differs from Protestant theology because of what we believe about salvation, which is the soteriology, is what a word for it is called, the study of salvation. The more traditional Christians, those that claim apostolic succession and all that, we generally will say that human beings are transformed by the sacrifice of Christ, and that's what the end of the good news is. That's what the end of the gospel is so that we can be transformed. Whereas a lot of Protestants will say, no, we're not transformed, we're only covered, right? We're only covered. Luther would give the analogy of we are just dung covered in snow, right? Whereas Catholics would kind of say, to use a similar analogy, we're dung transubstantiated almost into gold or something. So yeah, I think that pretty much does it, at least for now, in this question on suffering. I definitely need to do more thinking about it, particularly about other people's opinions on this question. And obviously I haven't gone through all of them. I apologize, I pretty much stuck to defending my own position here, but I do think that it's quite harmonious in a lot of ways, my own position, and I think it answers a lot of questions that are often asked when people are asking about suffering. So again, from a purely natural point of view, I think that suffering is good, is redemptive, can have meaning come out of it, that there's a purpose to it, and then obviously from a Christian perspective, a theological perspective, I would say that as well. All right.